Hi, I'm Jaclyn.
And I'm Courtney, and this is Caffeinated Crimes.
Welcome back to part 2 of Ted Bundy, and you guys are welcome that we're only doing 2 parts instead of 3, because you're probably going to be so done with Ted at the end of this episode, just like we already are so done with Ted, but...
Yeah, we haven't even started this likely hour-and-a-half episode, and we're already done, because Ted is just an asshole. Ted is a jerk. Ted is just... He just had to mess things up all the time.
Yeah, he's just, was the worst human being. So, we're ready to just knock this out and be done with him. We don't really have a whole lot to recap on because we record these 2-parters back to back. So, when you guys listen to part 1, we just recorded that yesterday. So, nothing has really happened for us to talk about. But if you guys do want some... unfiltered shenanigans, you can head on over to patreon.com/caffeinatedcrimes because we also recorded our monthly Q&A last night and, things got weird, so...
Courtney may have picked up her cat and was singing Miss United States. I don't know. We were a little slap happy. Like, I'd had a pretty long day. Like, it was kind of late. Mm-hmm. So, it was some shenanigans, but it was fun. So people can see us unfiltered because we don't know how to edit videos. So
yes, and get all kinds of animal stuff going on in the background that we always edit out of the podcast because when you have a combined 5 animals, lots of things happen. So
yes.
So with that being said, I think we're ready to dive into the rest of the Ted Bundy story and the tragic story of all of his victims. So yesterday we left off in Salt Lake City.
Yes, so we had just left off in Utah with Debbie, who had been taken from her high school.
Yes.
And usually at the top of the episode, we list references. So in part 1, all those references we listed are the same ones we used here. Primarily, The Stranger Beside Me by Ann Rule deserves its own little shout out. So Ted's in Salt Lake City, and he's not doing too hot his first year of Utah's law school. He's having a really difficult time maintaining a C average, and he finished the quarter with 2 incompletes. So he did come back to Seattle to hang out with Liz, and she at that point had turned him in the police, but she hadn't said anything. In her book, it was pretty interesting in the pictures, too, because she's like, here's a picture of me trying to act happy, even though I know I just turned him into the police and hope he doesn't find out. So...
yeah, that was super eerie to me.
And so, in January of 1975, Karen Campbell was vacationing in Aspen, Colorado. So, Karen was a registered nurse, and she was engaged to Dr. Raymond Gadowski of Farmington, Michigan. So they were on vacation with Raymond's 2 children from a previous marriage, and they were also there because there was a medical symposium on cardiology, so they kind of got to vacation while Dr. Gadowski could also go to his different, classes and stuff like that. So they all checked in at the Wildwood Inn on January 11th. The couple had argued that day because Karen was just really ready to be married. She was ready to, they were engaged. Let's go ahead and have a wedding. But Raymond had previously been married, and he wasn't exactly ready to jump immediately and quickly into a second marriage. So Karen was also suffering from a slight case of the flu when they arrived, but she was still able to go skiing and sightseeing, and on January 12th, they ate dinner with friends, and Karen ordered the beef stew. She wasn't feeling too well, so she didn't really get any alcohol or anything like that. She just had some milk with it. So they returned to the lounge at the Wildwood Inn, and Karen remembered she had left a new magazine in their room that she wanted to read. So she's like, I'm just going to go run upstairs, grab this magazine, come back to the lounge, hang out. So she headed toward the elevator, and all she had with her was the room key. And so she got off the elevator on the 2nd floor, and there were a few people there, and she spoke to them. And they watched her, walk down the hall toward her room. Raymond was still waiting with his kids, and the minutes kept dragging by, but Karen never returned. So he was kind of getting annoyed, and he's like, where'd she go? Why would she just leave? Yeah, why are you just leaving? I know we fought, but come on now.
Yeah.
And he's like, okay, I'm going to go check on her, just see. And so he realized that she had the key, so he couldn't get in, so he decided to knock. and he just kept knocking. There was no answer. So now he gets concerned. Like, as I said, Karen wasn't feeling good, and he's like, what if she got sick, or what if she passed out and hit her head? Like, she could be, in serious trouble. So he ran down to the front desk and got a duplicate key, but when he got into the hotel room, there was just no sign of Karen. Her purse was still there, the magazines were still on the nightstand. It looks like she had never made it to the room. And he was pretty confused, because usually she just wouldn't go somewhere without telling him. And he was like, I mean, maybe she saw some people and decided to have a drink, but that also seems unlikely that she would just leave and not tell me. Mm-hmm. So he took his kids to the room, and it was about 9 p.m., and it was very cold these nights in Colorado. And all she'd been wearing was blue jeans and like a light woolly jacket and some boots, which would not be warm enough if you were outside. You'd probably be very cold. Mm-hmm. So Raymond called the police, and they took a missing person report, but they said most people showed up, when the parties ended, the bars closed. They're not really taking him too seriously, because they're like, oh, your wife, like, all these people are here on vacation, and your wife isn't here at 10 p.m., like, yeah, come on. But Raymond insisted and was like, no, she's sick. She could be getting sicker. Like, this just doesn't make sense. So the police did broadcast her description to patrol officers on duty in Aspen. They questioned everyone they could, but no one had seen her after she said hi to the group at the elevator. So finally, Raymond packed up their bags, he went home, and he just hoped at some point he'd receive a call from Karen explaining, why she left. At this point, I think he just thought she just ran away and just didn't, I guess, want to be with him anymore.
Because people had seen her getting off the elevator.
Yeah.
You wouldn't think that she had been abducted in that situation. Like, how absurd to think that. And we talked about that in part 1, that's what makes Ted Bundy so scary, is that he was able to just abduct people pretty much in plain sight, like from the 10 feet between the last time someone saw them and suddenly they're gone, no sounds, without a trace. Like,
yeah, they did compare it to the Georgianne Hawkins, who was the girl at the sorority house who literally had like 40 feet until she was at her door. And like people had seen her for the other like 50 feet of walking. And so this is like very, very similar. And unfortunately, on February 18th, a recreational employee working a few miles from the inn found Karen's nude body in the snow. Her autopsy showed that she died of repeat blunt instrument blows to her skull and had, in addition, suffered deep cuts from a sharp weapon. So there wasn't enough tissue around her neck to say whether she'd been strangled, but her hyoid bone had been cracked. And just a little tidbit on the hyoid bone, it is a floating bone in your neck. So a lot of times they can tell like manual strangulation because that will break, where as opposed to if somebody is completing suicide and like hangs themselves, that hyoid can slip down and it does not break. So that is something, if you don't know, if you're not like me who just has all this weird information in your head, something to like know. So if the hyoid bone is cracked, they usually suspect some kind of manual strangulation where that hyoid bone just can't slip anywhere and then it cracks. So, and it was too late to tell if she'd been sexually assaulted, but since she was found nude, they do believe that rape was a motive in this case. Her stomach contents did show stew and milk, showing that she had been killed within hours of eating on January 12th. And it's likely that somewhere in that hallway she'd encountered her killer and had likely gone with him without a fight. And we know Ted would, pretend to be on a sling, need some help. She's a registered nurse as well, so she's probably like, I gotta help this guy, Like, I know my mom, if she took an oath, so technically if she's driving home and sees someone crash on the side of the road, like, dying, she is, I think, supposed to stop, like, and help them. Yeah. So one tourist did come forward and say she had seen a handsome young man who had smiled at her on January 12th, but she hadn't thought anything of it. So she'd left home before guests knew of Karen's disappearance, and after she was like, maybe this guy has something to do with it. Then on March 1st, 1975, 2 Green River Community College students were working on a survey project on Taylor Mountain, and there the remains of Brenda Ball were found, and it was confirmed through dental records. Cause of death was just impossible to determine, but the skull was fractured on the left side, so they did believe it was smashed as well by a blunt instrument. So early on March 3rd, another skull was found. I'm pretty sure it was one of the detectives, like, slipped and fell and then found some more remains, which is horrifying to think of.
Yeah.
So dental records confirmed it was Susan Rancourt. So Susan's skull was also really brutally fractured. But Brenda was also 30 miles away from where she'd been taken. And Susan was now 85 miles from where she'd been taken. So that's pretty far. And so now they're like, we think this killer is establishing a graveyard. Like, he's bringing remains here, which is terrifying. So since they had found 2 sets of remains, they kept looking. And the body of Roberta Parks, who was taken in May from Corvallis, Oregon, which was 262 miles away. So they're kind of being able to connect all these people now. So as with the others, her skull had been hit with a blunt instrument. And finally, they also found Linda Healy's remains, and she could only be identified by her mandible. And so these are all found in Taylor Mountain. So they continue their searches, but no more like remains or clothes or jewelry or anything like that was found.
But this also was a huge clue for police, because without any physical evidence, they had seen so many, like, patterns between all of these murders, but now you have all of these victims found at the same place. So it's like, okay, now it is for sure the same person in all of these different locations.
Yeah, especially since, one was 262 miles away from where she was taken.
Yeah.
85 miles, 30 miles. Clearly there's a connection. I can't assume 3 completely different people somehow brought them here.
Yes.
So at this point, Ted Bundy's name did remain on the roster of about 200 suspects, but he had no criminal background, so they weren't really looking too hard at him. And earlier, they checked him out some, and they were like, meh, whatever, not really. And then on March 15th, in Vail, Colorado, about 100 miles away from Aspen, Julie Cunningham was really sad from a recent breakup with her boyfriend, and she decided she'd go to a local tavern. Her roommate was there. She could have a beer or two, just, make herself feel a little better. But she actually didn't end up making it to the tavern, and when the roommate got home, she wasn't there. So they were like, this is a little suspicious, but Julie's disappearance was soon eclipsed by the news of Karen, so it didn't really get as much attention in the news. 25-year-old Denise Oliverson was living in Grand Junction, Colorado, and that's a town that's on the Utah-Colorado border. So she'd been in an argument with her husband and left their home on her bike to go to her parents' house on April 6, 1975. She was wearing blue jeans and a green printed blouse. If anyone saw her riding her bike that day, no one really said anything or mentioned it. Denise didn't arrive at her parents' house, but her parents weren't expecting her because she did just leave abruptly, just trying to go somewhere else. And her husband hadn't heard from her, but he figured she was still angry, she needed time to cool off, and that he'd call her tomorrow. So the next day, her husband was just shocked to find that she wasn't at her parents' house. So he contacted the police, and a search of the route she'd probably taken was searched. Police did end up discovering her bike and her sandals, and Denise's remains have never been found. On April 15th, Melanie Susie Cooley was seen hitchhiking in Nederland, Colorado, near her high school where she was a senior, and her body was found on May 2nd in Coal Creek Canyon, where she had been beaten to death in the head with a rock. Then, in the first week of June of 1975, Ted did visit Seattle, and so he was with Liz, and she talks in her book a lot about how she was very religious and she wanted to get married, and then there was this constant back and forth of okay, we'll get married, okay, we won't. So at this point, they do make plans to get married at Christmas, and she makes plans to visit him in Utah in August. Then on July 1st, 24-year-old Shelley Robertson failed to show up for work in Golden, Colorado, and she was last seen alive on June 30th. She did frequently hitchhike, but on August 21st, her nude body was found 500 feet down in a mine. Her cause of death couldn't be determined because she was too badly decomposed.
And I just want to note here, obviously some of the victims we have way more of a story for, and that's just because that information is out there. So with Georgianne Hawkins, so many people saw her and talked to her in the moments before her death. And then you also have so many women that like we mentioned in last week's episode, they were free spirits, they would hitchhike a lot, so it's like their last moments are really unknown, so we don't really have any stories leading up to their disappearance. And also a lot of those, we couldn't really find much information either in the book or online just about who they were as a person. So I just wanted to note that when there's some discrepancies in like the amount of story we have for each victim, it's not intentional, and that's why.
Yeah. And then on August 6, 1975 at 2:30 a.m., an officer noticed a light-colored Volkswagen Bug driving by his house. And his house, where it was very strictly residential. People weren't really just like, it wasn't like a side road to somewhere else. So the officer just decides to catch the license plate. And at this point, the Volkswagen Bug turns off its lights and takes off at a high speed, which is not what you want to do. That looks a little suspicious.
A little bit.
So he follows him for a bit, and the driver eventually does pull over, gets out of the car and said, "I guess I'm lost." And the officer is like, "Well, you ran 2 stop signs. You saw me and ran. Like, I'm going to need your license and registration." Mm-hmm. So he asked the man, what were you doing? Where are you going? And Ted said he was at the Redwood Drive-In seeing Towering Inferno. But...
spoiler alert, the driver is Ted.
Yeah, spoiler alert, the driver's Ted.
If you guys weren't aware of that.
Usually if there's any suspicious man in this story, it's Ted.
Yes.
But the drive-in was actually in the officer's patrol area, and he had driven by there, and Towering Inferno was not the movie playing that night. So the officer asked to look in the car, and he said he looked in and he saw a small crowbar and an open satchel. And so in the satchel was a ski mask, a crowbar, an ice pick, some rope, and some wire. So he's like, these kind of look like the tools of a burglar. So the officer did place him under arrest for evading arrest. And they did take the tools into evidence and said he'd probably likely get a possession of burglary tools charge as well. And so at this point, they're like, okay, there's been a lot of kidnappings. There's been a lot of disappearances. There's handcuffs. There's a crowbar, which Carol said in her story was used. Like, This is a little, like, could it be? Could it be? So on August 21st, the possession of burglary tools was added, and they did end up searching his apartment, but they didn't really find anything of significance. So Mrs. Graham had been there the night of Debbie's disappearance. I think she was the one who was in charge of the whole play and was like, dude, get out of here. I'm trying to do stuff. I can't help you.
Yeah.
And she positively said Ted was the one she saw that night. Like, she had no doubt in her mind. She was like, this is the man I saw. Mm-hmm. So Carol DeRanch wasn't as sure. So they had given her a book of mugshots, and she had pulled his mugshot out, and she was like, there's something about it, but I'm just really not sure. Like, she was very drawn to it, but she couldn't say for sure. Mm-hmm. So next she was shown Ted's ID picture, which looked like he did in 1974, and she picked it out almost immediately and was like, yep, that's him. So one thing you'll see about Ted is he changes his appearance a lot, and it really fucks with people. Like, he changes his appearance and people can't recognize him, basically.
Yeah.
So that is kind of the start of this too, but once she sees that picture of what he would have looked like during the time of her kidnapping, she says 100% this is the man.
And honestly, I think it makes her identification more reliable that she wouldn't immediately pick it out at first, because we do know that eyewitness identification is very iffy, and so if you have someone that's like, I'm 100% sure this is the person, that's not always accurate, versus if you have someone that's like, well, let me think about it, like, they're not ready to commit to it, that kind of shows a little bit more that they may actually be right, versus someone who is like, nope, 100%, and they refuse to, like, consider other options, you know?
Yeah. And they didn't just show her the picture and be like, is this the man? Like, they gave it in a book, and she picked it out of, like, pages of pictures. So, so Ted was released from jail, but he was under constant surveillance during September 1975. He did end up selling his Volkswagen Bug to a teenager. And at this point now, there is dozens of detectives in Utah and Washington and Oregon and Colorado, and they're all trying to get in contact. all these places where they have missing women, and they're like trying to get their information together, trying to compare notes, see what similarities there are, like could this all be it? And like Ted is starting to seem like a pretty good fit for a lot of cases. So on October 2nd, Ted was placed in a lineup, and Carol did pick him out again as well. And he was charged with the kidnapping of Carol, and he was released on a $15,000 bail, which was paid by his parents. So Ted went to trial for the kidnapping of Carol DeRanch on February 23rd, 1976. The parents of Melissa Smith, Debbie Kent, and Laura Amy were in attendance. So this trial is not going to bring justice for their daughters, but they really hope to see the man they believed was responsible for their daughters' deaths and see him put behind bars. So Carol DeRanch calmly and confidently identified Ted Bundy as the man who kidnapped her, even as she was being questioned by Ted Bundy, which must be so hard.
Yes.
And then on the stand, Ted admitted that he had lied to the police the night of the kidnapping and had evaded arrest. He claimed he was afraid of being caught with marijuana. So Bundy was found guilty of aggravated kidnapping, and he was sentenced to 1 to 15 years in prison. So while Bundy was in prison for Carol's kidnapping, Colorado's detectives continued the investigation into Karen Campbell's murder. So they did have gas receipts showing Bundy had been in Colorado at the time of her murder. And again, like from Salt Lake City to Aspen, I mean, that's like 6-hour drive, I think, around that time. So he'd have to use a lot of gas. So
yeah.
They also found hairs in Bundy's Volkswagen Bug, which were microscopically alike to hairs found on Karen Campbell, Melissa Smith, and Carol DeRanch. And just so we are, do point it out, hair analysis prior to DNA isn't really the most reliable, the most accurate, but this is what they used at the time. And Ted was also seen carrying a brochure about skiing in Colorado when he went to Seattle to visit Liz just after Karen's murder. The key resort Karen disappeared from was circled in Ted's brochure. And after speaking with Washington and Utah, Colorado's detectives were certain he was responsible for the murders as well. And at this point, Ted Bundy is then charged with the murder of Karen Campbell.
So then, on January 28th, 1977, Ted was moved from the Utah State Prison to the Pitkin County Jail in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, to await trial for the murder of Karen Campbell. On June 7th, a hearing was set to determine whether or not Colorado would seek the death penalty in this case. So Ted was transferred from Glenwood Springs to Aspen for this hearing, so that was about a 45-minute drive. And Ted was allowed into the law library during one of the breaks so that he could conduct research for his case, because, again, he is serving on his own counsel here. So while the deputy was standing at the courtroom door, Ted Bundy jumped from the second story of the jail out the law library and ran off on foot. He had planned this escape meticulously beforehand, and so he was wearing a second set of clothes underneath the clothes he was wearing. So when he got a few blocks away, he hid in some bushes and removed the outer layer of clothing. As we mentioned before, Ted was often changing his physical appearance, and now he was able to get rid of the clothes that everyone would be looking for him in. So now people that are like, oh, I'm looking for a man in khakis, and now he's wearing this blue shirt, may just look right over him.
Which, I hate it, but damn, Bundy, that was a good idea. I hate giving him credit, but also that was a little bit of a good idea, but don't murder people and then don't escape. Anyway.
Yes. So now that he had these non-recognizable clothes, he just casually walked back into town because everyone was spreading out of town because they're like, oh, clearly he's going to run away. And he's like, nope, I'm just going to stroll back in here while you guys are fanning out. Again, you could have used your brain for good, and I don't know.
That is the thing I do want to say about Bundy is he was intelligent, and I feel like if he would have put the energy into something else besides what he put his energy into, he probably could have done great things, and maybe we would know his name for something good. But instead, he just fucked up his life, and now he's known for this.
Yes.
So
like I said, he did plan the escape beforehand, and so he had stolen maps of the area from the law library, so he was able to use that to navigate the rough Colorado terrain. He did end up staying in an unoccupied cabin for a night, and then he tried to return to it a few days later, but people who were searching for him had already discovered that he had been there, so he had to leave there pretty quickly. So he was walking all around this whole time, just like circling the nearby mountains. And in the early hours of June 13th, which was a week after his escape, Ted stole a car that was near the Aspen golf course that the keys were left inside. And he was pulled over by police around 2 in the morning as a suspected drunk driver because he was swerving all over the road. So Ted wasn't drunk, but he was starving and exhausted, so he was just like unable to control the vehicle. So he was then recaptured just blocks from where he had escaped. So good job, Ted.
They do say that drowsy driving is almost as bad as drunk driving.
Yes.
And that a lot of times it can be worse because, like, drunk drivers at least will, like, try to react, where if you're, like, falling asleep, you might just, like, fall asleep.
Yeah.
But
so on June 16th, he was arraigned on charges of escape, burglary, and theft. Now, during this stint in jail, one of Ted's cellmates gave him a layout of the jail, and another cellmate gave him a hacksaw. So one day when he was on the phone with Liz, Ted told her that he didn't regret his escape and he would do it again if the opportunity arose. So pretty much setting it up here that this is going to happen again.
And I know Liz also said in her book that she had great anxiety every time Ted escaped.
Yes.
And she just was like, please, Ted, do not contact me. Do not come to me because I will have to turn you in. And she was like, I don't want to be in this position. Like, she's been kind of put in a horrible position this whole time. And she's like, oh, dear God, please do not contact me, Ted. Do not reach out to me. Do not show up to my house. I don't want to do this.
Yeah. So Ted was on his, quote, best behavior for Ted until around October of this year. And then he started using that hacksaw to cut a square out of the ceiling in his cell. It took him about 6 to 8 weeks to do this because he worked slowly at night while the other prisoners were showering and there was like more noise going on. And he was able to cover the hole with a metal plate that was there waiting on a light fixture to be replaced. So he was able to take it off, work on his hole, put it back. Nobody could even tell anything was wrong. He also, one of the things Ted Bundy is most known for, stopped eating so that he could lose 30 pounds to be able to fit through this small hole, planning his escape.
Yeah.
So during the Christmas break that year, the short-term prisoners had been released and he was the only inmate left. And during the last 2 weeks of December, his hole was finished, and so he would climb into the hole and crawl through, like, the attic space and the roof to, like, check out the layout of the jail to see where's the best place for me to escape. So for, like, 2 weeks, he's just, like, roaming around, like, in the ceiling and then popping back into his cell, and no one's noticing that he's been gone.
He's a bad rat.
Yes.
They had a bad rat problem. Sorry, I'm just laughing a little bit because it's, like, Bundy's hole. He just has this little hole, and it sounds so ridiculous, and it is so ridiculous in general.
And it also is just, like, absurd that he's the only inmate there, and he's able to, like, escape his cell and come back, like, multiple times, and no one notices.
You guys have one guy to make sure he stays
one
in
inmate.
cell. One guy.
So then, on December 30th, 1977, during his escapades through the ceilings, he finds a hole above a closet in the jailer's apartment. So this was a very small jail, so the man that ran the jail actually lived in an apartment attached to the facility. So Ted hung out there and waited for half an hour while he listened to the jailer eat dinner and chat with his wife, and they decided to go for a movie, so Ted's like, okay, cool, like they're gonna leave, I can tell they're leaving. So he heard them leave the apartment, so he then dropped down into the closet, dressed in the jailer's own clothing, and walked out the front door of his apartment. Just Ted.
Just chill.
So he did find another car with keys in it because everyone's just leaving their keys in their car in their 70s. So he stole the car, but it didn't make it very far. But then someone picked him up as a hitchhiker and dropped him off at the Vail bus station where he took the 4 a.m. bus to Denver. Then from Denver, he boarded a plane to Chicago and landed at 11 a.m. And remember, at this time, you didn't need the kind of identification to fly that you do today. So,
yeah. I just wonder where he got the money from. But I guess
Right?
plane tickets were probably maybe cheaper back then. But I'm like, dang, a plane ticket to Chicago from where I live is like $150.
I wonder if he stole money from the jailer. I don't remember reading
That
that
would make
specifically,
sense.
but it would make sense.
Yeah. I mean, or he could just like stand outside and be like, hi, can you give me some money? Like, I'm down on my luck, and probably get the money pretty quickly too.
True. So around lunchtime back at the jail, the deputies saw that Ted's breakfast tray hadn't been touched when they went to deliver his lunch. So then they finally entered the cell and found that Ted was gone, with a 17-hour head start, because they didn't notice he was missing for 17 hours.
And he could probably literally be anywhere in the U.S. Like 17 hours in a car, anywhere, probably.
So from Chicago, Ted took a train to Ann Arbor, Michigan, and then stole a car and drove to Tallahassee, Florida. And while he was in Florida, Ted rented an apartment under the name Chris Hagen. Again, where is this money coming from? I don't know. Ted would later say that he planned to get a job and live a crime-free life in Florida, but at the same time, he was also stealing multiple IDs, and it didn't take long for him to start stealing other possessions as well, because while he managed to come up with some money, clearly he didn't have enough money to live the lavish lifestyle that he wanted to, so he had to steal all of his belongings. And he never got around to looking for work because he was just enjoying his freedom too much and just like relaxing and having a good time. And it didn't take long for Ted to fall back into his murderous ways, unfortunately. So the Chi Omega sorority house was a few blocks away from the apartment where Ted was living on the Florida State University campus. And on Saturday, January 14th, 1978, most of the Chi Omega sisters had plans, as typical young college students would, on a Saturday evening. 21-year-old Margaret Bowman, who was from St. Petersburg, Florida, had a blind date at 9:30. 20-year-old Lisa Levy, who was also from St. Petersburg, had worked during the day and decided to go out to a popular disco that was located next door to the sorority house after she got off work. So she arrived there around 10 p.m., So roommates Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner were both out earlier in the evening. Karen had gone home to cook dinner for her parents and had returned before midnight to sew in her room before going to sleep. And Kathy went to a wedding and then dinner and then returned home and went to sleep before midnight. And Lisa only stayed at the disco for about 30 minutes because she was tired, and then she returned home alone. So around 2 a.m., two other sorority sisters that had been at the disco came home and were alarmed to find the door unlocked, but they had been having trouble with that door and the lock lately, so they're like, okay, it probably just someone wasn't able to shut it all the way, it's fine. They went inside. They remember seeing the clock said 2:45 a.m. when they went to sleep. And another of the sorority sisters arrived home around 3 a.m. So the door was standing open, but again, she knew they were having trouble with it, so she went ahead and went inside, and she heard a thump and then footsteps running in the hallway above her. And she suddenly saw a man wearing a dark jacket and a knit cap pulled over half of his face. And she saw that he had a sharp nose, but she couldn't really tell any other of his features, but he was carrying some kind of club. And before she knew it, the man had escaped out the door and was gone. So she saw another girl and told her that a man had been in the house, and so that girl grabbed an umbrella and they went upstairs. So they saw Karen coming out of her room, and she was stumbling and holding her head like she was sick. And then when they reached her, they saw that her head was just covered in blood. So they began waking up all the other girls, and they found Kathy in her bed, bleeding profusely from her head as well. So they called 911, and the police and the paramedics arrived very quickly, and paramedics saw that both Kathy and Karen had lacerations and puncture wounds all over their faces, broken jaws, broken teeth, and skull fractures. They were dangerously close to choking on their own blood, so they did have to open their airway. Both rooms were just covered in blood, and neither of the girls remembered anything as they were sleeping when they were attacked. So then police opened Lisa's room and found her body lying on her side with the blankets pulled up to her shoulders. So she wasn't bleeding like the others, they had to actively look for an injury. But they did see that she had pronounced swelling around her jaw, which indicated that she had been strangled. And then they found that her nipple was almost bitten completely off.
No, don't do that.
Nope. When they made it to Margaret's room, they found her body lying face down, covered with a blanket, and her skull had been crushed. So now police began canvassing the area because they're like, what the hell just happened here? Where is this person? Where did he go? So after fleeing the Chi Omega house, Ted Bundy, spoiler alert, it was Ted Bundy, if you weren't aware, he then breaks into the apartment of Cheryl Thomas a few blocks away. So Cheryl was a dance student at Florida State, and that evening she had gone out to a dancing club with some friends and then had tea and cookies with her date before arriving home just before 2 a.m. So her neighbors arrived shortly after, and they greeted her, joking about her TV being too loud. I'm pretty sure they lived in a duplex, so they were very close, and they were good friends too. So Cheryl then made herself a sandwich and fed her kitten before going to bed. So her neighbors woke up around 4 a.m. to what sounded like hammering coming from Cheryl's apartment, which just made me feel, like, sick to read that. Like...
Yeah, I know.
So the walls were thin, and when the hammering stopped, they heard Cheryl moaning and whimpering. So they called her phone, and when she didn't answer, they called the police. When police arrived, they saw blood was everywhere, and, like, with the swelling around Cheryl's face, they were honestly shocked to see that she was still breathing. So he literally had just, like, beat her over the head repeatedly. So Cheryl would be in the hospital for a month, and she would never fully recover from her injuries. She would be permanently deaf in one ear and would walk with an unsteady limp from the severe nerve damage. So her dreams of being a dancer were just, like, over at this point.
Fuck you, Ted Bundy.
Yeah, exactly. And I did find in an Elle magazine article that she did end up leaving Florida State University, and although she would never dance again herself, she would later go on to teach ballet and work with the deaf population.
No, that's gonna make me cry.
I know.
This one is just so hard because there's so many, like, just women who are in college and trying to get an education and working their way through school and trying to make the best lives for themselves and all that. And it's just so, just, like, crushing. Like, how many just lives he just ruined and ended. And it's just, it's horrible.
And so many of them he tricked into coming with him by, like, asking for help. And so there were people that just wanted to help people, you know? So it's like...
Yeah, and that's the thing, too, is, like, I'm always wanting to help people, but then, because of people like Bundy, I'm like, I can't. Like, I'm sorry. Like, I have to be rude, or not rude, but, like, I have to protect myself first. And I hate that there's a world that's like that makes us be like that.
Yes. So then on February 8th, 1978, so just a couple weeks later, 14-year-old Leslie Ann Parmenter left her junior high school in Jacksonville, Florida just after 2 p.m. So she walked to the Kmart across the street, and she was waiting to be picked up by her older brother. So Leslie's father was the chief of detectives for the Jacksonville Police Department, so she was, you know, very trained to be aware of her surroundings, to be cautious of people, that sort of thing. So Ted Bundy approached her in a white van, and he jumped out, blocking her path. He said his name was Richard Burton, that he was with the fire department, and he was wearing a badge that confirmed that. So Leslie didn't answer him because she's feeling uncomfortable, and she's looking around for her brother. And she's like, something just doesn't seem right here, and he just seems too, like, disheveled to be a fireman. Like, he's not put together, he doesn't seem in control, like, something's off here. So right then her brother arrived, and he, like, tells Leslie to get in his truck. So she did, and Bundy drives away, but Leslie's brother did have the foresight to write down the license plate of the van before it was able to get away.
Which is good.
Yes.
So then the following day, February 9th, Ted kidnapped 12-year-old Kimberly Leach from her school in Lake City, Florida. So Kim was a pretty and happy child. She'd have been elected first runner-up to the Valentine Queen at her junior high school. And during her first period PE class, Kim remembered that she'd left her purse in her homeroom. So her teacher gave her and a friend, Priscilla, permission to go get it. So they left using the back door, and that did open to a public street. So Kim got her purse, and her and Priscilla started walking back to PE class when Priscilla remembered she forgot something as well and quickly went back into the building. And so when she returned, she saw a stranger in a white van motioning for Kim to get inside. And a crossing guard would later remember the white van that was briefly blocking traffic that morning. A local lieutenant and paramedic for the fire department drove by at this time as well and remembered seeing a man in his 30s leading a young, dark-haired girl to his van. She was in tears, and the paramedic thought it was just a girl in trouble and had to be picked up by her father. Because that's probably what I would think. Like, you never want to think,
yeah,
this girl's getting kidnapped. Like,
I mean, especially... And not to put any blame on her, because I'm sure she was terrified and didn't know how to react, but if visibly she just looks, like, upset and not, like, screaming and fight, like, you're not going to reach anyone's attention. And I'm sure he threatened her and everything else. Again, not putting any blame on her, but just to kind of give the paramedic a little grace, because I'm sure some people are like, oh, well, like, you saw it and did nothing, but it's like, why would you think that was something? You know, like, you wouldn't expect to see, especially a man kidnapping a 12-year-old from the school in the middle of the day, just, like, walking her to his van. Like, that doesn't happen. Like,
and I feel like this was a thing, especially then, and even now, where it's like, you don't get into other people's businesses. Like, you're assuming this is father and daughter. You don't step in. You don't... That's not your place.
Yep.
And that's still a thing today. So, I mean, it's understandable.
Yeah.
That at that time, hindsight's always 20/20.
Yep.
So later that afternoon, the school attendance officer will call Kim's parents because she wasn't at school. And her mother's like, well, I dropped her off at school that morning. And the officer said she'd left during first period. So when Kim didn't return home at the end of the day, her parents searched the grounds of the school. And school authorities believed Kim had run away, which I can kind of see because, it's like, kids skip school sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
It happens. But her parents just really didn't believe it, and they were like, we're not having it. Parents know their kids better than anyone else. Listen to them.
Yes.
So when they called the police chief, he tried to assure them teenagers just often ran away, but he did put out a request for all patrolmen to keep an eye out for her. And so that afternoon, Detective Lester Parmenter had the license plate number ran for the man who tried to speak with his daughter the day before in Jacksonville. So when they tracked down the owner of the plates, he said he lost his plates the month before, but he just got new ones and didn't report them stolen. And police noticed that a white van had been stolen on campus on February 5th near that Dunwoody crime scene and believed there was a connection. So then they read the Lake City Bulletin about Kimberly Leach. His daughter Leslie was able to work with a sketch artist to create a composite of the man in the van who tried to speak with her. And on February 10th, stakeouts continue on the Florida State campus. A deputy was on duty when he noticed a man struggling with the car door. When he approached him, he said he was getting a book out of his car. And the deputy said the man just appeared wasted and exhausted. And he said he didn't have any ID and lived a few streets over, but he couldn't find any available parking on his own street. So the deputy then saw a license plate inside the car and asked who it belonged to, because a license plate usually shouldn't be in your car, it should be on your car.
Exactly.
It's a little weird. And the man said he just found it somewhere and was hanging on to it in case someone was missing it.
Which, how's that person gonna know that you have their license plate, Ted? That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, it's like, I'm just going to go around asking everyone I see.
Instead of leaving it where it was lost, where the person is more likely to find it, I'll just hang on to it for safekeeping in case I run into this person.
Or take it to the police who have the capability to search whose name.
That's probably a better idea.
So it's just like, what? So the deputy went to his car to run the plates, and the man took off over a retaining wall. So the deputy tracked the license plate to the man police had already spoken with, and then learned about the search for the white van. And there had been a white van behind the car that the man was supposedly unlocking, but when they went to look for it the next morning, it was gone. And guess what, guys? I'm about to shock you. You're never going to see it coming.
Nope.
It was Ted Bundy.
Yep. Shocker.
And the deputy did identify him as Ted Bundy later as well. So the next day, Bundy abandoned the apartment where he was super behind on rent. So we were asking where his money was. I guess there was none.
Yep.
He wiped the room clean and he dumped the van on the side of the road. So Bundy stole another license plate and put it on a new stolen VW Bug and left Tallahassee. He loves his VW Bugs.
Yes.
Which, as someone who used to own one, very rude, Ted, very rude. Don't
just ruin it for everyone, why don't you?
Ruin everything. So, at 1:30 a.m. on February 15th, police officer David Lee was patrolling his usual area in Pensacola, Florida. So he noticed an unusual orange VW Bug circling outside of a restaurant that he knew closed at 10 p.m. So the officer was familiar with the staff of the restaurant and knew it didn't belong to anyone who worked there. So he ran the plates and found them stolen, but the car wouldn't stop for over a mile. So when he finally stopped, Lee ordered him to lie face down on the pavement, but Bundy refused. Bundy then assaulted Lee as he was attempting to handcuff him and managed to run away. After firing several shots and a struggle for his gun, Lee was finally able to subdue Bundy, and Officer David Lee at this point just had no idea who he just arrested, what he was about to open a whole shitstorm with this arrest.
He's like, oh, I just have this weird guy who's running for no reason, and then you're going to find out that he's this serial killer who's on the run from prison for the second time, and you just captured him.
Yeah. So after giving a false name and having several sets of stolen identification on him, police realized this man wasn't who he said he was. So Bundy asked to make some phone calls and first called a well-known criminal attorney in Atlanta, Millard O. Farmer. So Farmer told him he'd send an associate to him the next day and he could tell them his name, but nothing else. So finally, he does identify himself as Ted Bundy, a man on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, and he made a deal for them to not release his arrest to the media, so he had a chance to call his friends and family. So the detectives actually didn't recognize the name until they did go and look at the FBI's most wanted list themselves, and then they were like, oh crap.
Like,
because, I mean, this is Florida. Everything else was kind of happening on the West Coast.
Yeah.
It's kind of before a 24-hour media cycle. Like, it would be a very different case if it was today.
Mm-hmm. But I still feel like, even being on the other side of the country, I mean, it's not the other side of the world. Being on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, you would think that most police departments would kind of have those
look
names
at that like every day.
Yeah.
Just like have it posted up somewhere.
Right?
You would think.
Next to the water cooler, like, come on guys. Like.
So he did call his girlfriend Liz and told her he was in custody and it was all over. Liz did take notes during this conversation so she could remember it later. And Ted tells her, I was afraid you would have nothing to do with me if I told you. It wasn't you, it was me. I just couldn't contain it. I fought for a long, long time. It got too strong. We just happened to be going together when it got underway. I tried. Believe me, I tried to suppress it. It was taking more and more of my time. So Liz asked if he'd ever thought about killing her. And Ted did confess to once blocking the chimney while a fire was going and leaving her home in the attempt to kill her, which I thought was a bonkers story too, because one, it's very different from any other murder he committed, and also like, oh, it's just horrible to think like I was asleep on my couch and he tried to kill me, like, and he was around my daughter.
And like I still had a relationship with him after that, like. And I wonder, she didn't mention specifically in her book if Molly was home at the time, so I don't know if she was and he tried to kill her as well, but I do know that Molly spent a lot of time with Liz's parents in Utah, like while they were in Seattle, so maybe it was one of the times that she wasn't there.
Yeah, and this is also a complete side story, but I was also thinking, because there is a lot of reports of Ted and some necrophilia, and how Liz got over knowing, like, I was in a relationship and probably had sex with him after he likely had sex with, like, a dead body. Like,
yeah,
that would create so much therapy for me. Like, that is so hard. Yeah, and, like,
poor Liz, man.
Forming a relationship after that, like, after you're in a relationship with this, like, straight-up psychopath, like, who lies to you all the time, like, Liz went on to live an amazing life, but still, like, that's hard. So Ted is pretty cryptic during his initial interrogations. He cries, he makes remarks that sounds like he's confessing, but then he backtracks and he just like won't finish what he was saying. And when Pensacola discovered that Bundy is suspected of 36 murders, he replies, add one digit to that and you'll have it. Bundy hinted that there were 6 states that would be interesting to the detectives. He described fantasies taking over his life, and when asked if he committed the Chi Omega murders, he said, the evidence is there, quit digging for it. When asked again, he says, I don't want to lie to you, but if you force an answer, it'd be no. So, when the stolen white van was taken into evidence, investigators found samples of soil, leaves, and bark in the undercarriage that could be identified as someone coming from somewhere near a North Florida river. So police began searching the area looking for Kim's body. In April, searchers stumbled upon an abandoned shed near the river and find a young girl's remains inside. She was nude except for a skirt and shoes, but the rest of her clothing and purse were nearby. And these items did match what Kim was wearing the day she disappeared. And then dental records did confirm that this body did belong to 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. The autopsy showed there was violence to her neck, but it couldn't be more specific as her body was practically mummified from being outside in warm and humid conditions for months.
So Ted Bundy went to trial in Miami in June of 1979 for the murders of Lisa Levy and Margaret Bowman at the Chi Omega house. And during this trial, he would reconnect with an old friend, Carol Ann Boone. Sure, anyone who knows Ted Bundy knows this name.
Yes.
So Ted met Carol in 1974 when they both worked at the Washington State Department of Emergency Services. And Carol began visiting Ted often, and they soon engaged in a romantic relationship. Now, during Ted's trial, the first row of the courthouse was packed with young women who were known as Bundy Groupies. And he would smile at them throughout the trial, and they would just, blush and giggle, and they just had this, attraction to this serial killer, which makes no fucking sense. Don't be like that person. Don't do that.
Yeah, please don't be that person.
As we mentioned before, Bundy is still serving on his own defense team. So the three women who were assaulted the night of Margaret and Lisa's murders, Karen Chandler, Kathy Kleiner, and Cheryl Thomas, would all testify about their attacks. And another witness also testified to seeing Ted leaving the sorority house that night. Now, the key piece of evidence in this trial was a forensic odontologist testifying that a bite mark left on Lisa Levy's buttock matched Ted Bundy's teeth. And Bundy's teeth were particularly unique, and so it made it even more clear that the bite belonged to Ted. Now, in later years, bite mark evidence would come under scrutiny, as there's no scientific evidence that bite marks are unique between individuals, and is also left up to the person interpreting it to decide if it's a match. But at this time, it was considered key physical evidence, and it played a huge part in the trial. Today, it would likely not be admissible, but thankfully other evidence and later confessions would prove Bundy's guilt, so we don't have to worry now that the wrong man was executed because of the bite marks, because it was for sure him, even without the bite mark evidence. So the trial lasted a month, and on July 23rd, 1979, after 7 hours of deliberation, the jury found him guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of attempted first-degree murder. Then on July 28th, the jury handed down 2 death sentences after an hour-and-a-half deliberation. Then we have what is quite possibly the most disgusting statement a judge has ever made to a convicted murderer. Now, Courtney and I mentioned before that Bundy was a very intelligent man, and he could have done so much good if he had chosen to, but clearly he didn't, so we're not celebrating his intelligence. But this judge said, quote, "Take care of yourself, young man. I say that to you sincerely. Take care of yourself. It's a tragedy for this court to see such a total waste of humanity that I've experienced in this courtroom. You're a bright young man. You'd have made a good lawyer, and I'd have loved to have you practice in front of me, but you went another way, partner. Take care of yourself. I don't have any animosity to you. I want you to know that."
And currently I am throwing 2 middle fingers up straight to this judge.
Did you miss the whole trial where this man brutally murdered 2 women and brutally attacked 3 others? And, also maybe that they're pretty sure that he did this to countless other women and escaped prison twice, but I have no animosity to you. What?
Can you imagine being these women's parents?
Right?
Sitting there, seeing the man who brutally murdered your daughter and multiple other people's daughters, and this judge is like, "Take care of yourself. I would have loved to see you practice in front of me." No, if that was my child and I was in that courtroom, I don't know if I could hold it in. I feel like I would start screaming.
That is absolutely ridiculous. So, then Ted went to trial for the kidnapping and murder of Kimberly Leach in Orlando, Florida on January 7th, 1980. So the crossing guard at the school and the paramedic who drove by the kidnapping both identified Ted Bundy as the man they had seen with the young girl getting into the van the day Kimberly was kidnapped. And witnesses also testified that Ted had rented a hotel room nearby after the kidnapping. Also, fiber evidence tied Ted Bundy to both the van and Kimberly herself. And on February 9th, which was the 2-year anniversary of Kim's kidnapping and murder, Carol Ann Boone took the stand. Now, we're going to talk about some more disgusting shit Ted Bundy did. So Ted, acting as his own counsel, asked Carol to describe where they had met and the nature of their relationship. Ted then asked her if she wanted to marry him, and she said yes. And then Ted said, "Will you marry me?" And again she said yes, and Bundy responded, "Then I do hereby marry you." Now, Florida state law said that a properly phrased open declaration in an open courtroom in the presence of court officers would make a marriage ceremony legal. So Ted and Carol had planned this, and they had a notary public present in the courtroom to sign the marriage license. So Ted and Carol were now married in the middle of his murder trial for a 12-year-old girl on the anniversary of the day that he murdered her.
Again, if I was her parents, I don't know. Because we also aren't going super deep into the trials, but Ted just did shenanigans the whole damn time. And that is so disrespectful. Like, if you genuinely did not do this, you would not be acting this way. No.
No.
You would not.
No. Like, and Carol, I'm sorry. Carol, what the fuck are you doing, girlfriend? Like,
yeah.
Don't even have any ounce of sympathy or understanding for you.
Liz,
not one single bit.
Liz, I feel horrible for. My heart breaks for her. Carol, go fuck yourself.
Yes. Next. So later that day, the jury did give Bundy his third death sentence. Now, Bundy was not technically allowed conjugal visits, but he and Carol would sneak behind water coolers and in the bathrooms to have sex, and eventually would just have sex in the open visiting room because apparently the guards just didn't care. So, I mean, no wonder Bundy was able to escape so many times, because these prison guards just don't give two shits, apparently. And Carol did eventually get pregnant and gave birth to either Rose or Rosa Bundy. I saw both names somewhere, so I don't know if one's a nickname or... Anyway.
Yeah.
But she did give birth to Ted's daughter in 1981. Then, in the summer of 1984, after losing appeals to the Florida Supreme Court, prison guards raided Bundy's cell and found, surprise, hacksaw blades, and discovered that he had been sawing off the bars of his cell and putting them back together with soap so you couldn't tell that it was, like, cut.
Oh my god.
So, Ted's trying to escape again. So the blades were confiscated and he was moved to another cell that they raided more often. So then I guess Carol came to her senses and stopped visiting her husband in prison, and she left for Washington in November of 1986 with their daughter. She did divorce him, and she never returned to see Bundy again.
And from what I read, she completely changed her name and her daughter's name, and nobody knows where they are now.
Yes, there's no information about them, which, like, maybe you shouldn't have married a serial murderer. I don't know.
Yeah, good for the daughter, because she's...
Yes.
Has nothing to do with that, and you probably don't want the last name Bundy for the rest of your life. But yeah. And
I really hope that no one has ever, like, tracked her down, because I would just feel so bad for her if that was the case.
Yeah.
So after numerous appeals, 3 stays of execution, and 9 years in prison, Ted Bundy was finally scheduled to be executed on January 24th, 1989. Now, the state of Florida spent $6 million on Ted's appeals. So just for reference, it would have cost them approximately $500,000 to keep him in prison for life. So, which is just a crazy fact about the death row system in our country.
Yeah, and I know a lot of people also say if Ted Bundy could have been kept alive and also, like, studied and researched, because he is so horrific and stuff, but...
So Ted still wrote to Liz often from prison, but one letter stuck out to her as particularly chilling, and he said, quote, "I have known people who, without saying a word, radiate vulnerability. Their facial expressions say, 'I am afraid of you,' and these people invite abuse. I don't know why, but they do. Is it their self-concept? By expecting to be hurt, do they subtly encourage it?" So that's just such a, like, chilling insight into his brain and how he looks at other people. So... after denying his involvement in these murders for 14 years, Ted Bundy was finally ready to confess on January 20th, just 4 days before he would be put to death. And Carol was supposedly horrified when Ted began confessing because she said she believed in his innocence this whole time. Sorry, girlfriend, you dumb. I don't even care. So, Detective Bob Keppel asked Bundy about Taylor Mountain, where they had found 5 bodies but had only been able to identify 4. So Bundy said that the 5th body was Donna Manson, who had been missing from Evergreen State University since March 12, 1974. He also told Keppel that there was another body at the site where he left Janice Ott and Denise Naslund. Bundy said that they wouldn't find any more of Georgianne Hawkins' body. He said everything they found was it. And they asked him a little bit about this murder because that one just seemed to be so, like, bizarre that how did you get her in such a short span of time in such a busy area. And he said the night that he murdered her, he was walking along the street using his crutches, and he asked her to carry his briefcase for him. And when they reached his car, he knocked her out with a crowbar, handcuffed her, and abducted her. He says that he drove her for a while in his car, and when he stopped, he took her handcuffs off, and he took her out of the car. He then knocked her unconscious again, and he said he strangled her with an old piece of rope before tossing all of her belongings out his car window on the way home. So when the detectives asked him about the 5 hours left unaccounted for that night, he says it's too hard to talk about. Is it, Bundy? Is it really hard for you to talk about? I'm so sorry.
Oh, poor baby.
And also, it's just like, what did he do to these women before and after he killed them? That there's 5 hours unaccounted for. He confessed that he left Janice Ott's bike in the Arboretum in Seattle after he killed her, which was one thing that came up a lot, that they're just like, how did her bike just disappear? Like, where did it go? So he did confess to that. Bundy does refuse to admit to killing the young neighbor, Anne Marie Burr, when he was 14. Anne Marie's mother, I think we mentioned this in the last episode, she even wrote to him just like begging for closure, and he wrote back and he's like, no, like, this one wasn't me. He also admitted to kidnapping and murdering a hitchhiker in Olympia, Washington in 1973. He confessed to murdering Julie Cunningham in Vail, Colorado in March of 1975. He said that he had asked her to help carry his snow boots, and he hit her over the head with a crowbar as well. For Julie, he said he left her body in the woods and came back for it later. He said sometimes he buried the bodies, sometimes he left them in the woods, and sometimes he tossed them in rivers. In the 4 days before his execution, Ted Bundy confessed to murdering the following women: Karen Campbell, Julie Cunningham, Denise Oliverson, Melanie Cooley, Shelley Robertson, Melissa Smith, Laura Amy, Nancy Baird, Nancy Wilcox, Debbie Kent, Roberta Kathleen Parks, Margaret Bowman, Lisa Levy, and Kimberly Leach. In addition to Anne Marie Burr, Bundy is also suspected in the deaths of Sue Curtis, Debbie Smith, Rita Lorraine Jolly, Vicki Lynn Holler, and Lynette Culver. He also confessed to murdering a woman in Idaho in September of 1974. So no body or missing persons report matched this confession, but I mean that doesn't mean that it didn't happen.
Yeah.
They just weren't able to corroborate it. And again, we've mentioned that there are so many names, there are so many stories that we just aren't able to tell, so many that we don't even know about. But in her book, I feel like Anne Rule had this line that just summed it up perfectly. And she said, quote, "How many more? Because Ted murdered so many, many women, he did more than rob them of their lives. He robbed them of their specialness too. It is too easy and expedient to present them as a list of names. It is impossible to tell each victim's story within the confines of one book. All those bright, pretty, beloved young women became, of necessity, Bundy victims, and only Ted stayed in the spotlight." Which is just so true, that all of these names just get lumped together under the umbrella that is the shithole of Ted Bundy.
And, sometimes it's so hard also to remember their names. Like, I'm guilty of this too, where I'm like, the one he murdered in Colorado, or the one at this house, or, the sorority girl at this place. He stripped them not only of their lives, of their futures, of their names. Like, he made them literally just Bundy victims, and it's, these women were murdered by Ted Bundy, and it's horrific.
It's like that's what their life and their legacy ultimately came down to, and that's awful. Speaking of awful things, when the King County Medical Examiner's Office moved, they lost the remains of Denise Naslund and Janice Ott. So the remains were kept as evidence. I don't know why at this point, but they were. But they lost them, and their bones were accidentally cremated with other unidentified bodies. So these families,
which is horrible,
who lost their daughters in such a tragic way, didn't even get the chance to handle their remains in the way that they felt appropriate, because they were just cremated with a bunch of other people. So you can't even get them back. So awful. So Ted Bundy's execution brought many onlookers in the days leading up to it, including hundreds of citizens who celebrated by standing outside with signs and chanting "Burn, Bundy, burn," and also holding up signs that said it's Friday, F-R-Y. So Ted called his mother twice the night before his death. He refused to pick his final meal, so he was given the standard meal of steak, eggs, hash browns, and toast, but he didn't eat any of it. There were 42 witnesses present for Ted Bundy's execution, and when asked for his final words, he said, quote, "I'd like to give my love to my family and friends." And he was executed in the electric chair and pronounced dead at 7:16 a.m. So Ted Bundy's brain was studied after his death in an attempt to explain such cruel and senseless behavior, but no abnormalities were found. And that is the end of Ted Bundy's life, fortunately.
Also, we're not going to post it because we don't really post these kind of things, but Jaclyn has shown me the picture of Bundy after he was executed, and it is frightening as well. Like, his face, like, it's just...
Very much.
I don't know. It's all just horrific and horrible, and I don't even have words for it.
Yes. Like, this one is just such a... It's been on our list for a long time, but it's been one we've been avoiding. But we do really try to put a different perspective on it and try to tell the stories of the victims as much as possible, which is why we left out a lot of Ted's courtroom shenanigans and Ted's ramblings, and nobody gives a shit about you, Ted. So we try to take out a lot of stuff that we didn't feel like was relevant to highlighting them.
I would really recommend, if you want everything and more, if you want Liz's accounts and Rule's accounts, because Ann Rule was a really big part in a lot of the like investigations before they even had a suspect, before anything like that.
Yes.
Do read both of their books. The Phantom Prince was recently re-released, which reminds me of a story I actually wanted to tell from Liz's daughter. So she kind of told her story as well. She had like an afterword in the book.
Which was super good.
Yeah, and she did mention a few awkward things with Ted, that Ted was a little inappropriate with her at times, but she also didn't really have the love, she couldn't remember loving Ted like her mom did. So when all this came out, she's just like, fuck you, Ted, no one cares what you have to say. And at one point, right before his like execution, he'd written Liz a letter, and Molly was home. She sees a letter from Ted Bundy, and she immediately throws it in the fireplace.
Yes.
She knows if her mom reads it, he might suck her back in, and she burns it. Ted did eventually ask Liz, like, why didn't you write me back? And Molly had to confess, but that was just such a moment of badassery for me, of her just being like, no, fuck you.
She's like,
nope,
we are done
out
with
of our
you.
lives.
I don't think so. In the fireplace, like, this is enough. Yes, she's amazing.
Yeah, and Liz's book was written, like, back very soon after it happened, and this is a re-release, so she does do a new foreword, a new afterword, kind of talks about reflecting on, like, what she had said and stuff, so it is really good. I would recommend it.
There's also the Ted Bundy confession tapes on Netflix if you want to hear more about the investigation and his confessions and all of that.
There is the movie that is based off of Liz's book. It's fiction. I don't necessarily recommend it. Zac Efron does an amazing job as Ted Bundy. I do want to say that. I have critiqued the movie, and I feel like people get angry. I just wish it focused on victims more and people who aren't a part of true crime, because I saw so many Facebook posts of, wow, this movie had me thinking like Ted Bundy didn't do it. And it's like, nope. We're not going to have that narrative. No. I also saw that, and I haven't watched the movie, but I saw that he, like, pleads guilty in the movie, and it's like, no, he never pled guilty. Like, it's just such a huge thing that, like, why would you change that? Like... Yeah, it was very, like, none of the victims or the murders, like, were shown, and, like, none of them were really talked about either until you got to trial. I do think it did a good job of kind of showing how Bundy could be, like, a people person, and how people could, like, believe him and stuff like that. Like, it did show it well that way, and I thought the acting was good, but just in general, people are like, I love Zac Efron, like, I'm gonna watch it, and then they're like, oh, I don't know anything about Bundy, I bet he was innocent, and at the end, all they did was just have, like, one slide with just the names on it of the victims, and I'm like, you could at least put a picture, you could put some information, like, something. Like, these women have already had so much stripped from them. Like, I just wish it had given them a bit more. So.
Yeah. So we do know that Ted Bundy killed at least 30 women, probably way more, as we mentioned. So we just want to acknowledge that there are probably many victims that we'll never have a name or a story for. And as we mentioned before, a lot of the stories we have, there are people like, you know, Georgianne, who was seen, and then Karen, who was seen right before. So all of these that we know, I mean, if you have these, you know, if you have someone that's homeless, if you have someone that doesn't have strong family ties, that they're just out hitchhiking, how many more women did he kill that have no story known because they were never identified, never found, nothing, you know? And we've talked, too, about how many women he approached that he asked for help and they said no and they left. So it's like, how many more women would he have killed if given the opportunity? You know, it's just, so bizarre, but we are very glad to be done with this episode. Hopefully we have told the victim stories in a way that is worthy of them. So Courtney, what is your perk of the week?
Okay, my perk of the week, I feel like is something I've said a few times, but I'm always like revamping it a little bit. My perk of the week is my niece and nephew. So I got to see them and hang out with them some yesterday, and my sister as well. We went over to look at a few like wedding things that she could. My sister's very, very creative, and she just has an eye for things that I don't.
Yes.
So I'm like, okay, this, like, what can I do with this? You know, like showing her all the things, talking with her, like what I'm thinking. And I got to hang out with my Eli and my Amelia, and poor Amelia wasn't feeling too good, but she was still a little sweetie. And Eli, it's just, he's constantly amazing me with how much he's learning. Like, he has, like, his whole, like, right arm, left arm, like, he knows them, and, like, you'll hold up, he has these little dinosaurs, and you hold them up, and he's like, T-Rex, Triceratops. I'm like, I didn't even know that was a Triceratops. Like, what? How...
Right?
Yeah.
I don't know these dinosaurs.
We're wondering if he might end up being a little OCD because he's very, like, these are how things are. But it's just crazy. Like, he repeats everything, but he retains so much. And I'm like, I bet there is so much in that little brain that you just haven't found the words to say yet. And it's so fun watching him grow up. And it's just so crazy that now, like, when I go for a hug, like, he hugs me. Like, he actually hugs. And he'll give a kiss. And he's so sweet. So that's my perk of the week because they're the little lights of my life, so.
That's the best perk of the week.
Jaclyn, what is yours?
So mine's gonna be just the fall weather we've been having lately. When you, like, walk outside and you have to, like, wear a jacket, and as I've complained about on the podcast many, many times, my house does not have air conditioning, and especially in the room that we record in. Like, I'm wearing leggings today. Like, we recorded, I think, a couple weeks ago, and I was wearing a jacket, and Courtney's like, you have sleeves. Like, what is this? Like, it's a whole new world. And, I mean, I'm just saying, like, relaxing in sweatpants is just a whole new level of comfort versus shorts and a tank top. Like, there's just something about bundling up. And anyway, so I've just really been appreciating that. So that's my perk of the week.
Yeah, fall is my favorite season. I love it. It's the best. And we're kind of getting, like, a little bit of fall, so I think it's supposed to be cold this upcoming week, though, I heard. So I'm like, that kind of sucks, but yeah.
Let's enjoy some of the mild fall before we get into winter. It's not winter time yet. We've said this before, but hopefully by the time this is released, we will have already done our drawing for our 100 Instagram followers, because we are one away. So if you are listening to this right now and if you've not followed us on Instagram yet, please go do that. But hopefully we've already drawn a name.
Yeah.
But you can find us on Instagram at Caffeinated Crimes Pod. And also, if you guys leave us a review on Apple Podcast, we're doing a drawing from both of those to get a sticker, a pin, and a $10 gift card to a coffee shop of your choice.
Yeah, so if you do listen to this and you didn't get picked for Instagram, you still have an opportunity on Apple Podcasts.
Yes.
And we will accept if you go on your mom and dad's phone and you say that was my mom and dad, and you show us proof it was you, like, I'll enter your name again. I ain't playing.
Yes. We'll give you as many entries as you got phones lying around.
Yes.
You can also find us on Facebook at Caffeinated Crimes Podcast, and we are also on Twitter at Caff Crimes Pod. That's CAFF Crimes Pod. You can email us at caffeinatedcrimespod@gmail.com. And if you guys want a bonus episode, because we always do a bonus episode with our two-parters, or our other bonus episodes, or our Q&As, Google Hangouts, any of that fun stuff, you can head on over to patreon.com/caffeinatedcrimes. And I think that's it. And I think we're done with Bundy.
So, yeah, hopefully we could give you a little bit more than things you've heard before. I know Bundy's a little bit overdone at times, but hopefully you maybe learned something new or you just reheard the story. But, yeah, go have a cup of coffee.
And don't commit a crime.